We're all adults here, right? I mean, not just our age, but in intellectual honesty. I mean, we want to know the truth. So why is there such a movement for the greatest myth makers in our society to sell us history with a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down? I mean, take Alexander Hamilton. When this country was founded, there were great principles, incredible things that happened that were worthy of glorifying in history and remembering forever. But let us not be naive. The great money powers in this world, which were, by the way, based in England, did not just let the equivalent today of trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars just slip away. Something else happened, and that something else is recognizable in history, but rarely sold through the television, movie, and stage play myths of our time. Hamilton. I just haven't quite got over what has been driving the sensation around Alexander Hamilton.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show.
I mean, yes, the Broadway play came out in 2015, was very big in 2016 and after. It was a certified Broadway hit. By now, it's something like the second best performing Broadway play of all time after The Lion King. And so that's definitely notable. But why? How did that happen? You know, what lies underneath its success? A play based on the history of a single founding father. There's just something unusual about it. And everywhere in culture, that Hamilton has just kept popping up. You know, in the opening song of the play, it kind of charges, his enemies have destroyed his reputation, and America forgot him. Hamilton is the forgotten founding father. Well, I don't think that's true. He's been on the $10 bill all along. His name is mentioned frequently in the classes that I took on government, but I don't know what other people experienced. I did find a paper as recently as 2012, written before the play came out, called Alexander Hamilton, the Unloved and Forgotten Founding Father. And it's basically about why has his reputation been attacked? Why is he viewed unfavorably in the country that has also, quote, forgotten him? Sounds very related. So I feel like there's a story there outside of just the musical, but which definitely encompasses the sensation that has been the Hamilton musical. And Hamilton has just been popping up all across the culture. You know, a couple years ago, we were outside of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, next to the Liberty Bell, and right across the way, there was a big Hamilton exhibit. That was several years back. I feel like it was probably timed with the success of the play. And sure, he's an important figure of history, so maybe it's just his time for an exhibit, but it seemed kind of coincidental. I don't often read National Geographic these days, but not too long ago I picked up one of their magazines that had various maps of America in the ancient times, in the colonial times, and for various important things in more modern times. And, you know, it was interesting for a variety of reasons, but all of a sudden they had a little sidebar on Alexander Hamilton. Of all the founding fathers, of the dozens of very important and significant founding fathers, they just happened to choose to do a sidebar on Hamilton. Surprise, surprise. And there's been dozens of other examples that I haven't taken note of that have just popped up across culture. Everywhere is Hamilton, and obviously the success of the musical has been driving that to an extent. But is the musical what's driving it, or is something else driving it?
Every time I come here, I like to touch this, because I feel like Alexander Hamilton touched it.
I mean, the musical was very big. My mother just called up one day, and she sounded like the Jerky Boys or Adam Sandler from his comedy CD days. And he was like, "Hello, Aaron, it's your mother. Why haven't you called more? I just been watching the Disney, and you've got to see this Hamilton. I'll send you a link on the internet. Oh, geez. Yeah, Mom, I love you too." And, you know, so she was pushing the Hamilton, and we ended up watching it. It's very entertaining. I don't want to take away at all. It was well done. The hip hop made it interesting and engaging. It was different from other history plays you've seen, and I understand how they made such a big deal out of it, but I also don't. I mean, it was interesting, but I picked up on the inaccuracies and the problems with the story they were telling during the first watch, the first time I saw it, with no particular background on Hamilton, just knowing some of the basics and a lot of the stuff about Founding Fathers history. I don't know, maybe I know more than the average person, but
with my pen, I'd be scheming, making bankers, lenders, lawyers look like diplomats of freedom. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?
But why? You know, what is it about this play that everyone has to talk about it? Was there something more to it than just a musical writer from New York City who happened to make it big on Broadway? I don't know. Anyway, there was just a number of context clues. I can't say exactly how they fit together, but it's given me this weird indication that there's something more to the Hamilton sensation than just the musical and just the biographical significance of this man, Alexander Hamilton. This has something to do with now. This has something to do with today and the world that's being built and unfurled and how people are meant to perceive the past moving forward. Anyway, the other day I was doing some basic research on something totally unrelated, and I just came across it that the Rockefeller Foundation totally partnered with and sponsored the Hamilton musical. What?
So monumental is their sway that I'm effortlessly rhyming my revolutionary rhetoric with their outsized inheritance and perfect timing.
It had already been on my mind. We did the trust game. We did a parody of Hamilton.
So, give me all your debts, and I will make it credit through a strong centralized federal government.
And it was definitely better than most of the musical, but maybe you don't agree. Whatever. The Rockefeller Foundation subsidized tickets and spent a couple $1 million, no big deal for them, to take underprivileged kids in New York City, school kids, to go see Hamilton for Hamilton. They took these outrageous Broadway prices that are hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and they cut a deal with the partnership they had formed with the musical and got it so kids could go see it for a 10 spot, an Alexander Hamilton bill. So they would put in just a little bit of energy, like a copay that happened to have Alexander Hamilton on it, so they could see the play almost for free when you consider how expensive it would be. And with this subsidizing of tens of thousands of kids just in New York to go see Hamilton, they also unveiled an educational foundation that was part of their partnership, a sort of historytainment exalting of Alexander Hamilton as a launching point for education about the Founding Father era, the beginning of this country.
So how has Hamilton maybe opened up your eyes?
Based around the play, which, while entertaining, if it's going to become education, if that itself is going to be the basis of history, has some major flaws, some major problems, and that's definitely where we begin to run into trouble, because you have something that is not historically accurate, is not a good basis of education, now being sponsored by one of the most serious foundations in the world and thrust into public schools across the country to thousands to millions of students, not only those who got to physically go see the play, but those who would see it online and do these educational, edutainment Hamilton things in their classroom. And there's no getting around it. This was targeted at a younger generation, 11th grade, I think specifically high school students. They were from inner city and underprivileged schools in particular. And they took these kids to go learn about the Founding Fathers with a play that was cast with Black and Latino actors, right? So there's an identity politics aspect to it right away. It's almost patronizing, assuming that inner city kids will relate to the hip hop lyrics and the diverse cast, except that it's also true. I mean, it's easy to see how anyone would connect with that, especially someone who's maybe more from that background. But it's a really interesting partnership. I mean, in particular, what made the Rockefeller Foundation interested in this play as a portal to educating the next generation? It raises questions. First of all, I just want to point out that we totally had this concept going on in high school. That musical did not do it first. Long before Hamilton took the Broadway scene by storm by hip-hopifying the Founding Fathers in a history redo, we all had to do sketches in both middle and high school. And I remember distinctly my classmate Taylor and I totally set rap lyrics in a 90s, maybe Beastie Boys-esque way to a presentation we had to do on President Taft. And it was awesome. I wish I still had that tape. It was also cheesy. And, my classmate was just nailing these rap lyrics with quasi-factual rhymes landing Taft. But the point is, admittedly, where I was in high school, where all the kids were, this rapified history was really heavy on the pointless reference to Taft allegedly getting stuck in the bathtub. That's kind of what the whole thing was based on. It was easily the most memorable factoid we learned about him at the time, and we probably threw in his status as being the only person to be both president and Supreme Court justice. But really, our rendition and everything we picked up on in history class about Taft had zilch to do with his family ties to the founding of Skull and Bones, or any other relevant history that actually speaks to the networks of power that dominate our society. And that's just true. As much fun as that was in high school, you could see how that extends to this sort of thing as well. Plus, we were completely innovative with telling history through rap. I mean, I have to say, I was part of being first on that. With that said, we're told that Lin-Manuel Miranda, who made his name on Broadway producing In the Heights, a musical based around a Puerto Rican community in New York, which makes total sense since he's both from New York and Puerto Rican, why this guy suddenly decided to take on Founding Father Hamilton.
I was inspired by a book I was reading on vacation, just for fun. Only a chapter into Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton, I realized Hamilton was the most hip-hop story I had ever read.
Supposedly, he just randomly was reading this book while on vacation from theater runs of this In the Heights play, which I haven't seen. Quoting briefly, while on vacation in 2008, Miranda picked up the 2004 Ron Chernow book Alexander Hamilton, an acclaimed biography of America's first Secretary of the Treasury. Having already developed an interest in the historical figure, Miranda was inspired to create a full-length work chronicling Hamilton's life. He was already interested in him, but we learn in the first chorus of the play that America forgot about this person, that Alexander Hamilton was the unloved and forgotten founding father. It also tells us plainly that the Federalist period, which took place from the ratification of the Constitution all the way up until 1800, when Thomas Jefferson became president, was an era dominated more than anyone by the influential Alexander Hamilton. I don't know how he got vilified if he got forgotten, but hey, that's what we're told. At any rate, the musical was very fresh. It hit the scene, but it really didn't have that much to do with the country's interest or lack of interest in who Hamilton was and what he actually stood for. What people related to was the emotional and entertainment content of the play. So the messaging about Hamilton kind of seeps through the cracks. It's kind of an undercurrent of the whole thing.
I am not throwing away my shot.
And part of my whole point in this video is that it really stands to be a bit of a miseducation. And more than that, it really is an opportunity for a new generation to recontextualize and reinvent not only what happened factually in history with the founding, but how they choose to view and perceive the founding. So maybe this speaks to the Rockefeller Foundation's interest in this. I think the excerpts from some of their articles are telling. This is from a Rockefeller Foundation blog, introducing Hamilton to a younger generation of New Yorkers. Last week, the world got a glimpse of what New Yorkers in the theater world have been buzzing about for the last year: the incredible cast and music of the Broadway hip-hop musical Hamilton. In fact, during the performance, Google saw spikes of search queries asking, "Who is Alexander Hamilton?" And one answer is the $10 founding father without a father, which is one of the catchier lines from the play.
$10 founding father without a father.
And actually, concerning his father, Alexander Hamilton descends from a long line of Scottish aristocrats, but the illegitimacy of his parents' marriage, because his mother was not able to annul her previous marriage that she was estranged from, it kind of gives Hamilton a legendary aspect. He's the founding father without a father. Like Robin Hood, he's sort of an important, entitled person who lost his inheritance and title, but as an underdog had the capacity to fight to gain back his glory and status through another route. And the sad byproduct of his tragic loss of his mother and the situation with his family in his early life is totally worthy of a Disney story. You know, it gives him a legendary character aspect that is actually factually true. But he came from kind of an important and notable line of people also.
And why should the people listen to you?
Because, unlike some other Robin Hoods, I can speak with an English accent.
At any rate, continuing with the Rockefeller Foundation blog, we are all more than excited that over the next year, 20,000 New York high school students will have the opportunity to see the show at a greatly reduced price of $10. Thanks to an educational partnership formed by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gilder Lehrman, Hamilton producer Jeffrey Seller, Hamilton creator Lin-Manuel Miranda, and the New York Department of Education. The $1.5 million grant from the Rockefeller Foundation will also help to develop educational programming to bring the show's creativity and artistic expression into social studies classrooms around the city. Educational programming, you say? By the way, this Gilder Lehrman Foundation also brings Hamilton creator Lin-Manuel Miranda's father into this partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, since he is part of this Gilder Lehrman Foundation. He's on the board of it. Anyway, they're talking about educational programming being brought into social studies classrooms around the city. That's very interesting that this musical would be the basis of that. Another RockefellerFoundation.org article has a case study of the human impact, the struggle for history and freedom in our country that is ongoing. And they talk about how at this point in time, this was several years back, they had already reached 180,000 plus students and teachers participating in EduHam. That's the Educational Foundation, the Hamilton Education Program, EduHam. And they had 73 schools just in their pilot program in a majority of the states of the country. So, icing the cake of the next generation of political thinking, this highly stylized edutainment model was used to cater to a woke generation that hasn't necessarily discovered enough context about history to know what it's talking about. But it's a younger generation that likes the messaging being sold to them by various institutions. And this isn't just from EduHam or just the Rockefeller Foundation, but it's a generational swath of technology and media molding their thinking, suggesting ideas, supplying messaging to the righteous anger of a younger generation that's starting to come into its own. There's something about that whole aspect. So this isn't just about these partners in particular. It's not just about Hamilton, but Hamilton's an extremely good example of what's going on here. By the way, this kind of generational programming, this generational molding of ideas by no means is just part of the millennial generation, the woke generation. It was done big time in the post-war consumer period in rebooting the entire thinking of a then soft and moldable baby boomer generation. It was repackaged to the next couple generations as rebellion and counterculture, identity expression, defiance and role refusal, inversion of typical roles, and really the pushing of logical boundaries in all directions. Questioning things that do deserve to be questioned, but having ready-made solutions to those questions. Anyway, in the redefining and updating of history, Hamilton has enabled students today, this is from the blog, to connect with the founding era and claim it for themselves. And they can retell its stories in their own language, says the Rockefeller Foundation blog. To feel inspired by actors who look like them, to discover that idealism and activism mattered to the founders as much as they matter to us today. That's a very different type of message about the founding of this country than you would have found in textbooks 20, 50, 75, 100, 150 years ago. It's very different that today they're going to take Hamilton and to encourage them to claim history for themselves and retell the stories. Revise history in their own language and to decide what matters to them, analyzing the past and seeing how you can turn it into something of your own. This feels a little bit like giving yourself permission to rewrite history and then present it to new generations that don't know any different. Totally fine to have perspective and difference of opinions and to scathe for what it is the problems of the past. But you've got to be tied to reality with that too. And I think reality has become one of the moldable factors in this new wave that we're seeing. The idea that reality itself is up for a redo is one of the major issues we face today. There's always been young, impressionable people, and things change over time, but what's really going on here, I do question it. And, you know, for many people who see this play or learn about it in their classroom, it will be all that they know about Alexander Hamilton and quite possibly all that they know about the founding period of this country's history. What they say in the play matters when it's the cornerstone of an education.
Because this is about me getting mine. I, Hamilton, represent the orphan, the disconnected, the immigrant, the poor, cast aside and disaffected.
Is what they say in the play accurate? Does a play or a piece of entertainment have a responsibility to be historically accurate? Well, I guess that depends on what its purpose is and who its audience is.
Some historians have criticized Hamilton, the play, saying that it really overstates how anti-slavery he was. It's kind of whitewashing history a bit there.
Well, I'm choosing to not look at that part. I'm enjoying it too much to be tainted by anything.
So there's another play about Hamilton, and I don't think probably very many people have seen it, but it's worth pointing out. It's called The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda. That's the creator of the Hamilton play. The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda is a play by American writer Ishmael Reed that critiques the acclaimed historical musical Hamilton.
I'm an iconoclast. It's good to have me around because I'm skeptical. Our play is losing money, but I feel satisfied that we made a statement.
Depicting a fictionalized version of Hamilton's creator Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's visited by several historical figures missing from the musical in a style similar to Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol play.
Mr. Lynn, stop! Are you the man that wrote the play about Alexander Hamilton?
Yes. And who are you?
My name is Ben, Mr. Lynn. I'm the slave who was returned to Miss Angelica Scholar Church by Mr. Hamilton, sir.
And echoes critiques made by other historians about the whitewashing of Alexander Hamilton. He accused Miranda of whitewashing Alexander Hamilton's role as a slave owner and his involvement in the genocide of Native Americans. Miranda definitely uses race as part of the context of what he is teaching the audience, right or wrong, in good context or not. The idea that it's a consumer fraud, I'll entertain because I know some of the history that was skirted around masterfully. I mean, this guy probably could have made a Nazi leader look good by writing clever hip-hop lyrics about them. Or someone who was just average and neutral could have made them seem like a hero. And a lot of good writers could do that. But is it ethical to do that? Is it responsible to pluck someone from history and to obscure the facts that they very much represented? In this case, I'm definitely talking about his role as an agent for central banking generally, not just as the first Secretary of the Treasury. The Haunting offers Reed's critiques of Hamilton, which includes, quote, turning a blind eye to the Schuyler family's ownership of slaves and soft-pedaling Alexander Hamilton's elitist politics and his attitude towards slavery. Again, you know, everybody just lit up with Hamilton and embraced its message, and I don't know how many people embraced it with any kind of critical thinking. That's my biggest issue.
Well, I'm choosing to not look at that part.
Then Miranda wakes up, and the other spirits appear to inform Miranda about their lives, while Lin-Manuel appears confused. He doesn't understand what the dream meant, and he continuously defers to the Ron Chernow biography of Alexander Hamilton to justify the content of the musical, because he based the musical on the book and took what he liked and left the rest.
Alexander Hamilton was an abolitionist.
Ben's right, Mr. Miranda. Hamilton, an abolitionist? What kind of abolitionist would sell me and my son?
At any rate, in the play, they go on to confront the author, Ron Chernow, who's unapologetic for his part. Chernow's a little bit interesting because he not only wrote the Alexander Hamilton biography that Miranda used to base his famous musical upon, but Ron Chernow also wrote Titan, which was a pretty positive spin on the legacy of John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is not unlike pictures one sees of old popes. In manner, he is singularly simple and natural and genuinely kindly. Definitely, they do bring up some damning issues in the biography as well. His unrelenting opposition to organized labor brought out a more antediluvian side. But at the Rockefeller Foundation themselves praise Ron Chernow's biography, Titan, and praised positive things that he pointed out about their social work and whatnot. So, In essence, the Rockefeller Foundation approved of Ron Chernow's Titan biography, which may well have been authorized from the beginning. They weren't upset about controversies raised there. They liked the spin that he put on it, and what that has to do with his future career, writing of the Alexander Hamilton bio, or the success of the Hamilton musical, or the partnership of the Rockefeller Foundation with the Hamilton musical, well, I'll leave that up to you to figure out.
I'm enjoying it too much to be tainted by anything.
But there is something else involved with this, and it's curious. It's curious. The article from the Rockefeller Foundation says Edutainment was launched in 2016 to engage, now at this point, 250,000 high school students and teachers in low-income areas throughout the country. Students use source documents to research historical figures or events and then create their own performance pieces, which they present at a culminating event at a theater that includes seeing a matinee performance of the musical and a Q&A with cast members. The show's star and creator, Lin-Manuel Miranda, called Edutainment our favorite thing we do as a company. He made it for entertainment, he made it for his own career, but also it became a source of education and Edutainment, and that's now his favorite aspect of it. Wait till you hear about his dad. Lin-Manuel Miranda's father isn't just anybody. This isn't a Puerto Rican kid who got lucky and made it on Broadway or who was just particularly talented. I think he is talented. I will not try to take that away from him, but Lin-Manuel's father has a bio that's pretty noteworthy, okay? And his father's name is Louis A. Miranda Jr. He is, and has been for some time, a political consultant who's advised New York Mayor Ed Koch on Hispanic affairs. He became a board member of the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation and continued to be under several mayors. He was reappointed by Mayor Giuliani. Louis Miranda Jr. has been political consultant to Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, and numerous other political figures, and he is on tons and tons of boards. He's the head of various organizations. He's been on the New York City Board of Education. So again, you start to think about how does a musical that's entertainment transition into becoming a form of education. Well, this guy's father is part of the New York City Board of Education. He has ties.
Don't need the hard sell, won't make a stump speech, cause this place is really awesome. Yeah, this habitat's the beach. Wow, he's good.
And his father's even been part of the Nielsen's Rating Advisory Board, the National Television Secretive Board. A long time ago, I was trying to do a piece on TV. I was actually back in high school in the newspaper then. I tried to call up the Nielsen Ratings Agency. I was just curious about commercial time. I was writing a piece about MTV and all the commercials they had. And the Nielsen Ratings place, it was a closed door. I called and I got the cold shoulder. No information, no other number to call, no website to go to. It was kind of early for websites. They came off to me, without knowing any better, as a bit of a secretive agency. But they got all these people in their homes with a special box to record what they're watching, and they base demographics and engagement of television programs on that basis. The Nielsen ratings. Pretty important, pretty interesting board to be a part of. Very weird that this Hamilton guy's father is part of all this stuff. It is, right? Louis Miranda Jr. has been part of several school and educational boards, and that includes being a board member for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the very organization partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation, who are behind the Edutainment initiative. Just by the way, Lin-Manuel Miranda's older sister, Luz, is also the chief financial officer of the Miranda Group, which is the strategic consulting firm for both government and communications that was founded by their father, Louis Miranda Jr., circa 2000. And the Miranda Group specializes in lobbying, legislation support, and targeted messaging. Quote, whether it's a challenging piece of legislation or the creation and implementation of strategy regarding a specific issue, the Miranda Group's experienced professionals work closely with clients to achieve success in an ever-changing city and state that often sets local, national, and international benchmarks. So, excuse me, I don't know what all is going on here, but it feels like something else is possibly involved with this. There's a scent of an agenda. The Hamilton musical, great on its own, questionable when it becomes a source of education? And who is that education targeted at? Not older generations. They watch the play too on the Disney Channel or possibly in the Broadway seats. But this whole organization, this whole strategy was primarily targeting young, impressionable students, many of them from the inner city, many of them just broadly from the younger generation, and telling them that this is a piece of their education, molding them into thinking in a certain way. Or not. Maybe it creates independent thinkers. I don't know.
Coincidence? Glad you thought it. It's my favorite version of the story. So glad you bought it.
But it did make me curious to revisit the facts and history of the life of Hamilton, who very much did have a terrible childhood. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was an elite descendant of a French Huguenot family. He came from notable families on both sides, but he was still an orphan who was from an illegitimate family and who definitely had it tough. His mother, Rachel, was estranged from her first husband. The guy was abusive, it sounds like. There was no way for her to get a divorce when the guy wouldn't allow it. It was really strict rules in those times. So when she met Hamilton's father, James Hamilton, they appeared to form basically a common law marriage, but it was technically out of wedlock, and the law dealt very harshly. But at the same time, his bio father, James Hamilton, was in his life, did continue to write letters after he left the family, and he was a descendant of the elder Alexander Hamilton, who had the title of being the Laird of the Grange of Ayrshire in Scotland. Again, he came from a wealthy and privileged landowner background. Not the same kind of background they're selling to children of an inner city school. It's just not. Unfortunately, this made Alexander Hamilton and his brother bastards in the eyes of the law. He was treated with very serious exclusion in the society of the 18th century, and strictly indeed on the islands of Nevis and St. Croix, where Hamilton had his ties and spent his early years. And thus his father, James Hamilton, couldn't live with the family. Perhaps he did provide for them in some way we don't know through connections. But that's speculation. I really don't know. His mother had been persecuted and jailed by her former husband. He used the law to go to great lengths to assure that all the estates and things from her side of the family only went to his child. One of the key things in that estate, by the way, were the slaves that were part of their estate. It looks on paper from a distance like she got depressed, died of some disease, and, she made orphans of Alexander and James Jr. when he was, I think, 10 or 11. His birth years disputed, so it's hard to know exactly. But he was young. There's no doubt at all that this was a serious blow psychologically to Alexander Hamilton. It would have affected him very deeply. So I do have sympathy for his backstory, I do. And it probably goes a long way towards explaining his extreme penchant for social climbing and status seeking. But that's kind of what defined his adult life. After he was orphaned, Hamilton was taken on as a clerk at Beekman and Kruger, and this was the import-export firm on his island for trade with New York and New England. It was a banking firm. And thus by age 11 or 13, because Hamilton's birth year is disputed, Hamilton had become a banker as an early teenager, even a preteen. He was adept enough that the senior management left him solely in charge as a teenager, I think age 14 I read, when the proprietor was away on business travel. So he wasn't just a clerk with a part-time job. Hamilton was a banker involved in running the business. And the business of Beekman and Kruger on Nevis and St. Croix and the other islands in the Caribbean, of course, it was slave plantations specializing in sugar cane and related products. Yes, so it's the same type of disappointing history. Their banking business was closely tied to these cruel institutions, and slave trade was part of it. It was. Not that the weight of that falls on young Hamilton. It doesn't. But he was in the business of slaves and sugar trading from a very early age as a banker. The bankers at Beekman and Kruger decided to pull together some money to send this kid for education. To send him to the American colonies for study. Of course, these banking and trade investors connected him with known merchants from their network. When Hamilton arrived in 1773 on the cusp of revolution, he began staying right away with people from this network. And the one that's mentioned in the play, he first stayed with Hercules Mulligan, who was a merchant connected with this firm and who was also part of the Sons of Liberty. He was part of the revolution, and he was a spy during the war, and so he was part of that whole effort. And he put Hamilton straight away into the mix of secret societies and networks should be so influential in what was to come. But there's no value like the right type of introduction to the right type of person. His life could have turned out so much differently if he hadn't been introduced to the right people and had the right people backing him. His life wasn't altogether fortunate, but there were fortunate things working in his favor. So yes, he was an immigrant and an orphan, but a pretty well-connected one, all things considered. And because of this, he was able to afford a sort of quick prep education before attending King's College, the forerunner of Columbia University. And this was aided in part by the founding father, William Livingston, another associate of Hamilton's, who would go on to become the first governor of New Jersey, who was a representative in the Continental Congress. These were the type of friends and associates who were his benefactors. Livingston sponsored the young pupils' time at the Francis Barber Grammar School, and at King's College, Hamilton would enter the political scene, debuting at the Liberty Pole, waxing philosophical about the conflict with Britain, and really cutting his teeth with the very important people who would be part of the revolution. And in addition to that, he helped form a secret literary society that was considered a forerunner of the Philo-Lexian Society. And in that regard, it was pretty similar to Thomas Jefferson's experience, who came from an extremely wealthy and privileged background, who did have his parents, and his involvement with the Flat Hat Secret Society Club at William Mary and his day, respectively. Like many other founders, Hamilton became a lawyer, and he formed influential fraternal connections. That's how it was done at that time. Through his involvement with a network of elite colonists, including the Sons of Liberty, Hamilton became involved in organizing militia and military efforts, raising money and raising armies in the struggle against the British. Now again, how did an orphan get to the point of helping to raise money and armies in the growing conflict? He had connections. Among other things, he helped to raise the New York Provincial Company of Artillery with fellow founder and partner John Jay. They had a long relationship. He took part in the 1776 New York military campaigns. He was in multiple battles and efforts before being recruited pretty well in the middle of the war directly by George Washington, the top general of the entire Revolutionary Army. Nobody seems to agree on what drew Washington's attention to Alexander Hamilton of all people, going out of his way to persuade the younger to become his aide-de-camp, effectively his chief of staff, his second in command for the remainder of the war. A very powerful position that allowed Hamilton to call many of the shots. He had some real power here. I say for the remainder of the war, but that is until late in the war, when Hamilton would go on to demand of Washington to give him a commanding post in the army so he could get military glory to advance his career, which allowed Hamilton to preside over the pivotal Battle of Yorktown alongside French units and be part of and have on his resume that he was part of capturing the British army that led to the de facto end of the war. He was there just at the right time for some real military glory, which he demanded of Washington. Very interesting. At any rate, becoming Washington's aide-de-camp in the middle of the Revolutionary War was a really big deal, and nobody really knows what made Hamilton such a shining candidate for this. Yes, he had done some things, but so had a lot of people. But I'm guessing his significant ties to money and finance were a big part of it. Hamilton was the key figure behind the Bank of North America, which he founded in 1781, not long after he became aide-de-camp. It was chartered under the Congress of Confederation to help finance the war effort, and his chummy pal for life, Robert Morris, was made the U.S. superintendent of this new bank, which again was pivotal to winning the war from the financial side. A year before, in 1780, while aide-de-camp to Washington, Alexander Hamilton met and soon wed Elizabeth Schuyler, who again is played up in the movie, oh, she's just some random girl. I think he met her at the tavern. She was just so beautiful and
just an average guy meets girl, my Eliza. Not an arrangement of wealth concealed from prying eyes, and not a result of connections to my new circles of power barely disguised, and just a simple girl, Eliza.
Just a random coupling there, but they really kind of go out of their way to obscure and minimize in the musical that Elizabeth Schuyler was daughter of one of the wealthiest families in all New York. She was an heiress to the power structure.
Your family brings out a different side of me.
Through her mother, she was related directly to the Van Rensselaers, the old-line Dutch family that essentially owned New York, at least in terms of acreage and in terms of a lot of the political power.
I came from rags, but now my riches are certain. Repping for my father-in-law, lord of lands, elite in-laws. You think I'm playing?
In the family that became notorious as the ruthless and powerful landlords who faced a second revolution against their renter tenants who went to war with them. Through the Van Rensselaers, these renters lived by old Dutch feudal codes. They were basically feudal tenants. First in the British-dominated colonial America, and then soon after living by the same feudal codes in a free and liberated United States of America that had won a revolution for freedom and certain principles. Here were thousands and thousands of people living under a feudal system even after the revolution. And Hamilton married into that family, would become a lawyer and agent for the Van Rensselaers in their controversial dealings with tenants. Hamilton, who was so pivotal to the U.S. federal system, the creation and setting up of the Constitution, and who really helped create this free America, was also part of this after the revolution.
Well, I guess that's not really how we met. We got hooked up, power couple mashed and set. But it's good drama for the next few bars. A relatable girl in the song, just a girl Eliza.
The creation of the federal government was very much a function to the dominance of banking in this new country.
Better for the state relative to cash?
By the ultra-wealthy families, those who had so much acreage and wealth and power that they outsized most of the rest of the people in the country. At any rate, in the wake of the Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton was scheming hard. He was not satisfied that the country had simply won this revolution and now that there is this chance for this free country. He immediately seized upon criticism of the weak powers of the Continental Congress, which basically left most of the power to individual states and which required complete unison agreement from all 13 states in order to achieve any major decision. Hamilton instead yearned for powers that would supersede this, namely the power of taxation and the power to raise and use an army that wasn't reliant upon the consent of each and every state or even any of the states. He really wanted to overturn that system and put in this federal system as soon as possible. It was definitely his big agenda. There's no question that it empowered the already well-established money powers and further established the powers of money itself. Hamilton is rightly noted for his role in writing the majority of the Federalist Papers, which encouraged support for the new nation's constitution. But what were those writings really about? No doubt he worked very hard, as the musical portrays well. He wrote much like he was running out of time. But who was he working for? That's an important question too. Which money powers was he really representing? And the more you look at it, the more the creation of the Constitution, though developed certainly with many other notable and famous founding fathers, was driven more than anything by the pressures and desires of Alexander Hamilton to set up a federal system that could supersede the states. It was a top priority, and I feel like, in hindsight, that's what was driving the debates and the quorums to form and create the Constitution. That was the urgency. You mean that orphan immigrant Hamilton? That overlooked and forgotten member of history?
Not throwing away my shot.
He certainly didn't give up his shot, but where did he get the power to call the shots? What was really going on here? The whole impetus for the creation of a constitution, the primary function of which was to establish the powers of a federal government that superseded individual states, was driven by Hamilton and his silent partner's desire for taxation and banking powers. Above all, period. He wanted the power of taking and making loans. Taking loans from Europe, making loans within the country. He wanted the interest. Interested parties wanted that interest. That's what was driving the Constitution. That's what was driving Hamilton. This isn't just some bootstrap orphan. That's the biggest myth of all.
No gravitating, ascending, ladder climbing, magnetic drawing into power. I'm just writing pages each and every hour.
This whole issue quickly reared its head shortly after the Revolutionary War in the form of what has come to be known as the Newberg Conspiracy. Starting in March 1783, really not long after the war was over, leaders of the army, officers namely, began raising hell over their promised back pay and their promised pensions, and they began to form a body threatening, at least implicitly, violence and unrest if they weren't paid. And so the issue that emerged in the public consciousness was that of a rogue or standing military threatening the new civil government.
Shall we stand down and receive nothing for our efforts, or shall we rise up and force Congress to give us satisfaction.
And it was a crisis the young country was unsure how to solve, but proposals were made to authorize a one-time payment through the Continental Congress with the agreement of all the states, or to institute a duty tax on certain imports to float the cost of what was owed to the veterans. Those proposals, they might have worked or they might have failed, but we never got a chance to find out because those proposals were rejected, and the force of that rejection came from Hamilton and his closest allies.
I say that Congress cannot hear words, only action.
Alexander Hamilton, working along with Robert Morris, the wartime head of his central bank, and Governor Morris, who confusingly is not related to Robert Morris, but is also another fellow traveler, they were found out, it's later been proved, to have been working behind the scenes during this Newberg conspiracy with this issue of an unpaid army to make sure that other potential solutions to paying them were rejected. They would not allow other solutions to just solve this crisis. And simultaneously, they were working behind the scenes to stoke the anger of these army officers and their followers. Hamilton even wrote privately to Washington asking for permission to privately take direction of the Army's angry cadre and was seeking really to stoke their angers behind the scenes.
That if any army be allowed to terrorize civilian government for political ends, the future of this country will be lost in darkness.
Washington saw through that and he got angry on principle.
You have read this? Yes. Broadside given to all officers except your commander-in-chief. It calls for the army to take over the government.
If you will not lead us, sir, stand aside.
You will not march on Philadelphia.
But as with other times between Washington and Hamilton, Washington really didn't stand up enough, but he didn't go for it.
Very men on whom I've always relied are now ready to fail me by asking me to forswear honor and principle.
At any rate, Hamilton in this Newberg conspiracy, which naturally has a more detailed and scheming substrate, a lot of details I'm not going to cover here, was attempting to use this unpaid army issue as a means of gaining for Congress, for the federal government, the power of raising revenue. That was his agenda and he stuck to it. When other groups also revolted over unpaid army wages, as with the Shays Rebellion, Hamilton was also there to harp upon the issue and bring it to public attention. He was driving public sentiment, the news of the day, towards his pre-scripted singular solution, and that's not an exaggeration.
When we could just buy the power once or twice, and if the 13 won't fund the army, we got another plan that's going to be quite stormy.
The violence that did happen with the Shays Rebellion precipitated the change that Hamilton wanted. Quoting from Stanley L. Kloss, in the summer of 1786, former veterans, merchants, and moneylenders deluged Congress daily, in person and with letters to be remunerated their back pay. Money and goods loaned to the United States for conducting the successful war against Great Britain. In September 1786, a conference was called by Virginia to discuss various ways of facilitating commerce by establishing interstate rules and regulations under the Articles of Confederation. The meeting was held in Annapolis, but only 5 of the 13 states even bothered to send delegates. They needed to, quote, devise further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, the emergencies. Old-timey language, but in essence, they wanted permanent emergency powers for the federal government, and they wanted them now. And it was Hamilton, Madison, and Dickinson, 2 of the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers. Now, a surprise. Although Madison's role is a little confusing. By May 1787, with the country flagging under suspended loan repayments to France and other crises going on, key Americans, including Alexander Hamilton, had convinced the representatives of Congress to form a constitutional convention that would bring enough delegates to create a quorum so they could legitimize the creation of a constitution. And Hamilton was on the committee forming the rules for that convention. In June, Hamilton presents his plan for the federal government, which counters the previously introduced Virginia Big State Plan, the New Jersey Small State Plan, and other proposals that had been introduced in favor of what became known as the British Plan, that would put extreme powers in a central government with a president and senators for life. This plan was criticized heavily by his sometimes partner, sometimes adversary James Madison for favoring a, quote, British-style monarchy and seeking extreme concentrated powers that would perpetuate a tiny, wealthy elite over the new United States. Hamilton's proposals for the Constitutional Convention supposedly ostracized him from the other delegates, but the process was in the works anyway.
When I was younger and more enthusiastic, I believed we needed something quite drastic, like constitutional liberties and democratic expression to counter the aristocratic system then existing. But now that I'm older, by a couple years, and repping in Congress, I see these democratic impulses as smoldering, chaotic, and rotten. And this broader system of repping for the people, it suffers from faction, inaction, infirmary of purpose, is constitutionally lax and unevasive.
According to Madison's notes from that convention, Hamilton said in regards to the executive, quote, "The English model was the only good one on this subject. The hereditary interest of the king was so interwoven with that of the nation and his personal emoluments so great that he was placed above the danger of being corrupted from abroad. Let one executive be appointed for life who dares execute his powers." This textbook tells us plainly that the 1787 Constitution was a, quote, undemocratic constitution. It also tells us that the Federalist period, which took place from the ratification of the Constitution all the way up until 1800 when Thomas Jefferson became president, was an era dominated more than anyone by the influential Alexander Hamilton. Not by George Washington, who was president, but by his Secretary of Treasury. And that to Hamilton, the ideal government was not a democracy, but an aristocracy. This is a quote directly from page 86. And that Hamilton's devotion to this ideal eventually carried him too far. In the end, Americans grew suspicious of his monarchical designs, and in a bloodless revolution at the polls displaced his concepts with those of the more liberal Jefferson. There's the first cabinet. Hamilton also went on to argue, quote, "And let me observe that an executive is less dangerous to the liberties of the people when in office during life than for 7 years. It may be said this constitutes it as an elective monarchy, but by making the executive subject to impeachment, the term monarchy cannot apply." In his notes of the convention, Madison interpreted Hamilton's proposal as claiming power for the rich and well-born. Madison's perspective all but isolated Hamilton from his fellow delegates and others who felt he did not reflect the ideas of the Revolution and liberty. Or so we are told, for Madison and Hamilton went on after this to work on the Federalist Papers together. Anyway, as the debates continued, Hamilton backed out of the public spotlight, apparently having freaked everyone out after calling for a monarchy after fighting a revolution against Britain and outing himself as just a total elitist who wasn't for the people at all. But after this process, he still ends up in the Constitutional Convention on the final draft committee anyway. He was one of the handful of people involved in creating the final draft of our United States Constitution. After being one of many of the signers, Alexander Hamilton, with this final draft signed and submitted, goes on in October 1787 and begins publishing the first of many Federalist Papers urging the adoption and ratification of the Constitution to create a government that has the sovereign power over money and military, among other features that end the short experiment in a confederated quasi-independent states in a supposedly free country. It is what it is. Some have argued it was absolutely necessary, and maybe that's so, but do not obscure or minimize the role of Alexander Hamilton as a banker and elitist married into one of the wealthiest families that ever existed in this country from the agenda to create that Constitution. With the ratification accomplished, Hamilton and Governor Morris then led the private campaign to pressure a tired and ready to retire Washington to accept the presidency. It was like a Shakespeare play. Well, no, not the crown, not the crown. Oh, come on, yes, you must. Maybe you've seen those. They worked to get Washington to accept the presidency in spite of his reservations and reluctance in order to cement together the public sentiment necessary to support the new Constitution and get this ball of the federal government rolling. For his part, Hamilton expected a high-ranking position in the Washington administration, which he very much received. Almost to the point of the junior pushing around the senior. Persuading, rather. But Washington backed Hamilton's every move. He questioned it, he fought with Hamilton in private, but he really didn't go against anything that Hamilton proposed in both terms of his presidency, in spite of great public controversy, and it was a big public controversy at the time. So if Washington couldn't say no to Hamilton, even though Hamilton was younger, had less power, and Washington had the love of the country, could have truly called the shots, who was really in charge? I think really this is a case study of the first shadow banker controlling the first president. You tell me. During the Washington administration, by 1791, Alexander Hamilton, as the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, succeeded in establishing the first bank of the United States, a successor to the Bank of North America, which was now being privately run. The new first bank was chartered by Congress and became the nation's first de facto central bank, long before the Federal Reserve, as we pointed out in the trust game. Hamilton's program as Treasury Secretary was coupled with assuming all the state debts on the national level, which was so much more controversial than you could imagine. He also established the tariffs of 1789, the tariffs of 1790, and the highly controversial excise tax on whiskey. Hamilton's former partner in the Federalist Papers, James Madison, led the opposition to the debt assumption plan and later to his national bank plan, asserting that it exceeded constitutional limits of authority for the federal government. Gee, you think? And so the ball began rolling, the exceeding of constitutional limits of authority right there in the first term with the first president, with the first Treasury Secretary. And there's no going back. Those powers have never been recovered here in the supposedly free United States. This issue has never been dealt with any teeth, and those in power are afraid of those who are really in power, is what I think. And the structure set up by Hamilton heavily favored the money classes, who were dominant, particularly in New York, and Hamilton really delivered in a serious way for the wealthy, aristocratic minority reminiscent of those who dominated in European society. And he was even part of setting up the Cincinnati Society, which was going to formalize the creation of an hereditary aristocracy based on the veterans of the Revolutionary War. That still exists, but because of Washington's opposition, it doesn't formally have the teeth that it otherwise might have, but Hamilton tried. Gotta give him that. At any rate, the Hamilton musical, now fronting as Edutainment, portrays Hamilton primarily as a man of the people, a humble and disaffected orphan who beat the odds, who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, as an immigrant who might also harbor the spirit of a racial minority. He was the founding father without a father.
Founding father without a father.
Indeed, much of the play suggests that Hamilton's priorities were for equality. In fact, he did exhibit some abolitionist sentiments, but the larger context of his record shows clearly that his priorities had nothing to do with racial justice or equality amongst the people. His priorities were squarely centered around the centralization of power in the hands of a tiny elite at every step of the way. This is patently anti-equality, pro-banking.
A bunch of revolutionary manumission abolitionists. Give me a position, show me where the ammunition is.
Things might have been different if his priorities in pushing for the Constitution weren't so centered around the banking powers and the quasi-permanent institutional authorities that he proposed. But then there probably would be no Hamilton in our history books at all. Sorry, it's true.
The following year in 1790, Hamilton issued his Report on a National Bank, advocating the creation of the Bank of the United States modeled after the Bank of England, i.e. a private shareholders' bank to support national interests. Hamilton proposed a further centralization of federal government powers, absorbing state debts into federal debt, then about $75 million, which thereby established credit with international governments. Hamilton defended his proposal by stating in part, quote, "The debt of the United States was the price of liberty. So the price of liberty is having a central bank." Didn't hear him singing that one in the Disney musical, did you?
And you know it's gaining interest for our international lenders. Surrender under Caesar and make Washington, D.C. our top vendor. Wall Street, Rothschild in the house. Yeah.
The sins of slavery do not fall more so on Hamilton than others of his time, but he also married into a family that owned slaves.
My father-in-law, a landowner seated in the Continental Congress, who sees his reflection in an orphan suitor, destined for history to be a Broadway star.
His closest political ally and boss, George Washington, was one of the largest landowners and slave owners alive at the time. As a teenage banking clerk, he traded in slaves and plantation goods. Despite seemingly good intentions, his involvement with the New York Society for promoting the manumission of slaves was clearly not where he put his true focus and energy. Not when it counted, because history shows that where Hamilton put his focus, he achieved great things. Many founding fathers failed on the slavery issue. Many shrinked from what they knew to be a failed moral principle. Many of them, including slave owners, expressed outrage at this. Many of them supported proto-abolitionists even though they owned slaves. Many of them indicated that they might go on to support it but never really did in a meaningful way. But really the whole generation is disappointing on that front. An immediate compromise was issued in the creation of the Constitution, prohibiting even the discussion of ending the slave trade for 20 years. That was put in the Constitution, and over which Hamilton had enormous, really outsized sway. A pivotal document that focused on the problems more important to Hamilton and his moneyed allies, not a document that addressed persecuted minorities or the slave trade.
And alluding to discounted power designed for carrot-chasing workers who thought that liberty included an economic upgrade or equality and deciding.
Many were concerned at the time, but none of them had any priority or teeth on the issue when it came to actually drafting the Constitution. Sad but true. The Bill of Rights, addressing the rights guaranteed to individual people and to the rights retained by the individual states, which theoretically would restrain the overreach of the federal government, was insisted upon by Hamilton's political enemies and written by James Madison, the draft of it anyway, and it was fought for by the anti-federalists who wrote letters against the Federalist Papers. They had their own series of papers, and they were the backers of the Bill of Rights. It was they who insisted upon it. And the adoption of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution was really a corollary. It was a concession to make ratification by all the states possible and more likely, and to minimize those who had doubts and objections and who otherwise would have just rejected the Constitution wholesale. But these rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights were never the focus of Hamilton.
States all overgrown with rights. Too much freedom is dope, and dope kills.
Stop it. Get some help.
If sentiment and doing the right thing morally had been his priorities, history would have been different. We can be sure of that. The musical spins in circles around the facts to obscure and minimize his career-long focus on enhancing the wealth and power of the already wealthiest in America. His closest allies all served aristocratic and even monarchical ends. His wife was part of a landowner dynasty that denied the American dream to peasant farmers who had shaped and developed the land they were on, but which they could never own and could never get ahead on.
With my pen I did fight. But fight for whose right? For the rights of a system of hereditary selection and monetary bondage to keep progressing. A revolution, for certain. But where's the social uprising? The power stayed with those that already had it. Is that surprising?
The powers he delivered to the centralized federal government and to the private banking sector, those powers which he gave away, have never been recovered and probably never can be in this country, and they've been permanently tilted away from benefiting the average Americans or the underprivileged Americans of this society. So that's what happened. That's the real history, and it was amazingly whitewashed and obscured in a super well done, catchy, invigorating, energetic musical that captured the imagination of our contemporary society. But why were the facts obscured? Why was the messaging tailored in such a certain way? Who indeed was Hamilton at the time as a historical figure speaking for, and who indeed does the Hamilton musical of today speak for? What's the agenda behind that? Were these all just the whims and ideas of an upwardly mobile orphan and immigrant from the Caribbean? Really? Is that what you believe? Nothing else was behind it? What else is really going on?
With my pen, I'd be scheming, making bankers, lenders, lawyers look like diplomats of freedom. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?
Do you think that the play goes too easy on Hamilton? That it paints him out to be this really woke, progressive, anti-slavery guy when maybe he wasn't?
Maybe he wasn't. I agree. But
And why was the Rockefeller Foundation, an institution of one of America's all-time wealthiest and most powerful families, so eager to pick this whitewashed, cherry-picked production as a pillar in the new tellings of history?
again, let's keep in mind, it's a play. It's a piece of entertainment.
Who do they intend to educate with this carefully crafted narrative? And what will those who follow its version of history learn about the past?
I'm choosing to not look at that part.
Again, let's keep in mind, it's a piece of entertainment.
And the world now being unfurled. At the end of the day, this is about perspective.
It's a piece of entertainment.
Melissa just reminded me when I was about to record. Did you see the Quentin Tarantino movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
I'm Sharon Tate. I'm in the movie.
What happens when you change the narrative from the sad facts of what happened factually to what you wish to tell, what you wish would have been the story? What happens when you tell that story on a broad basis to everyone, to as many people as will watch? What happens when you change that story? Who does Hamilton become then at that point? And who is the Hamilton of the musical that really does live in the hearts of people who caught a spark from it?
You know what I'm saying.
I think we got it right with the might of monarchy. I broke this.